Shalom and welcome to Life Lesson segment 19. We are beginning now the second half of the book of Exodus that we're moving in to a new direction. Till now we were speaking about the Exodus and what follows after the Exodus, the splitting of the Red Sea, and then the revelation of the Almighty on Mount Sinai by giving to the people the commandments. And now we're discovering a new directive from God. Till now, everything was from above. God is coming and saying, this is what I want you to do. And here we learn about where God says that I'm not just up there in heaven. I want you to build me something down here in this world. And that's something new that we didn't have till now. When we look in Genesis, in Chumash Bereshit, about the patriarchs, even by Noah, we find they built altars, they were serving God, but always it was kind of that there is a distance. We know God is all over, it's just out of description we say He's above. But it's just because to bring out the point how really there's no physical contact to the naked eye, because this is total spirituality and beyond that, and this is something physical, and we would think that there's no connection. So it's something distant. You're praying because you believe in God, but it's not necessarily something that it is close. And here, and we saw that throughout the troubles in Egypt, there was suffering, and they're crying to God, and the suffering is still going on. So we see that there was the distance there. And then came God, took them out of Egypt, and then He says to them, get ready, I'm going to give you the commandments, and there's a revelation. But what is the description of the revelation? God descended on Mount Sinai. He descended. He came from wherever His abode is, from where His domain is. He came down here in this world. Okay? And then we continued with segment 18, Mishpatim, which talks about the laws, where it was down to earth, about all the laws that we do, that we should know, that it all comes from the Almighty. But now we introduce that is not enough all this. God says, make me a place down here in this world. In the words in this section known as Terumah, which means contribution, as we're soon going to see, the commandment is Ve'asu li migdash ve'shachanti betocham. They shall make a sanctuary for me, so I shall dwell amongst them. Well, number one, it says in the plural, I should dwell amongst them. It doesn't say I should dwell in it, in each one individually. It doesn't say that it's not just I should dwell in the sanctuary itself, but also it means amongst them by each one. Where this is a little bit an unusual language. Because if He's asking, build me a sanctuary, that's enough. But it's not enough by saying, build me a sanctuary. It says, I will dwell amongst them. So this is an interesting phenomenon. But what's interesting is the introduction to it. So this is what's happening for the rest of the next parashiyot, the next segments, till the end of the Exodus. It's all talking about this idea. It's here we have the instructions, how this sanctuary, the dimensions of this sanctuary. Then we have the clothings of the high priest. And interesting enough, it repeats itself, all the details. Usually we know that everything in the Torah is precise and exact. And sometimes there's one verse that contains the whole commandment, and that gives so much explanation through our sages to try to understand every word. Here, we're going to see that it kind of repeats itself quite a lot. The commandment of God, Moses repeating it to the Jewish people, them actually doing it in all the details. So in other words, the commandment and its details is repeated and repeated again and again. We are told from a previous occasion that this has happened in the book of Genesis, that when something is beloved in the eyes of the Almighty, then it's repeated again and again. It is to tell us how precious it is in the eyes of God. So that means this idea of building a sanctuary, building a mishkan or a mikdash, this is something very important. But if this is something very important, I would have thought that this would be the beginning of the directive. The first verse says, God spoke to Moses, and he told the children of Israel, they should take from me a portion. From every man whose heart motivates him, you shall take my portion. In other words, they should take a donation, a contribution from everyone, and that's how they're going to build this place. So in other words, the majority of the materials that they needed to build this structure came from voluntary contribution. And this is another interesting thing here. Normally, we see God demands, and he says, do this, do that. And if you don't do it, we see sometimes, more than sometimes, the punishment that it's mentioned in the Torah. But all of a sudden here, when it comes to such an important matter of build me a sanctuary down here, a structure where you could pray, what it's known in our days, what we call it, a house of worship, that this is exactly when this is introduced. Because still then, the idea was, and it's still, wherever you stop, you could pray to God. But here comes an addition. Build me a place, a house of worship. And this special house of worship is going to eventually be in Jerusalem, where the temple stood for so many years. Right now, he's talking about the traveling tabernacle that was for 40 years in the desert. But how is it going to be constructed? We know that some part of it, that is going to be talked in another segment, like the sockets of the walls of the Mishkan, that was from a donation from everyone, a half of a silver shekel of a coin, and then it was melted, and that was used for the bottom of the walls. But just that. But everything else, it was donated. Gold, silver, copper, all the items that are mentioned here. So number one, first comes the commandment from God and says, tell the people they should donate. Normally, first you tell them what the purpose is. You should build me a house of worship. How exactly are you going to accomplish that? Then you tell them we need everyone to help out. Here the introduction is right away, V'yikchu li terumah, they should take from me a portion, a contribution, a donation. So why is that mentioned before the purpose? So that means to say that this idea that it is a voluntary aspect of everyone is something very important in building this house of worship. And that brings to a very important point. The important point is the idea in Judaism that the highest level of serving God is when we do it because we have all the feelings to do that, not because it is forced on us. Voluntary. So here when it comes to the building of the house of worship for God, God says, if your heart feels like giving, then you should give. It doesn't say it clear, but that implies. But if your heart doesn't feel like giving, so don't give. And that's something very different that we see in so many other situations. It's very clear as you read throughout the whole 5 books of Moses, as we would say the Bible, that so many things is, there's no such thing voluntary. It doesn't say voluntary you should keep the Sabbath. No, you have to keep the Sabbath. If you believe in God and you belong to the Jewish people that accepted these commandments, you need to keep the Sabbath. There's no you have an option. And here all of a sudden, to build a house of worship, God says you have an option. And I quote you from the verse again because it's important to see this. It's repeated a few times. God spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and let them take for me a portion from every man whose heart motivates him. You shall take my portion." So if a person doesn't feel like his heart motivated him, then you don't have to give. So it has to do with the idea of volunteering. So even though we know that everyone gave, and they gave more than what they should have done. It says it was an amazing contribution that went on. Everyone came, men, women, children. It was an amazing thing what was happening to build this structure. Psychologically speaking, some people would say that a lot of times if you want to accomplish something, if you say it in a language where the individual feel that they are doing it by choice, it's going to be more successful. If you come, even when it comes in educating children, we know that very well. If the child feels that this is something that it is good for them, and they have a feeling towards it, it will be accomplished much more so than just saying, do it. And that's the way it is. Because they may do it, but what guarantees that later on in life they don't rebel about what they were told? But if it's done because the parents did it in such a way that the child should feel that it was their decision, even though not necessarily it was so. It's very tricky, no question about it. But here in a way some would say that maybe that was what's going on over here. But really if we look more than this, it's more than this, because it's very clear what he says over here. I want you guys to feel good about what you're doing and to feel that it is done as a voluntary situation. We know that from the previous segment. In the previous segment, it's written that when God asked them about the Torah, would you do it? They replied and said, Nase v'nishma. We will do it, and then we will try to understand it. We will do it, and we will understand that. So in other words, it's not just the doing it, it's also the understanding it. So because some people would say, why even try to understand? Just do it because God said so, and that's it. But we know that very clear, especially in Judaism, that that's not what God wanted. God wanted that we should have a feeling in what we're doing. Human nature is that when they understand something, then it's done with much more joy and with much more excitement. So God wanted that when we perform our Judaism, it should be with excitement. We should be excited about what we're doing. Not just, I have no choice, I have to keep the Sabbath. No, I'm excited to keep the Sabbath. It's a whole different story. And therefore we see here when finally it comes to the purpose of everything, that what? To create a place for God down here in this world. That by itself is an unbelievable statement. To create a place means a physical place where there is walls, where there is borders. To what? To the Almighty that is above limitation, that is above space. So this is an amazing thing. We're the one that is above time and above space and above limitation says, make me a place down here. And that is the purpose that we have to try to do all the time to the Almighty. But how is that accomplished? From every person whose heart motivates. And to bring out the contrast later on in history, how that not exactly was followed, and that's why that created a lot of problems. So there's an interesting story in the prophets. As you know, every week when we read the portion in the synagogue, because every Shabbat we read a portion. So when this portion is read Terumah, afterwards it also a portion of the prophets is read that corresponds to an idea that was discussed in the written Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. So when it comes to this Parsha in Terumah, it's a whole discussion from the book of Kings. From the book of Kings, how King Solomon built the first temple. And we described there how God gave wisdom to Solomon, and then he was able to come up and build this humongous building that was known as the first temple. It's very interesting what it's written here. It says he created, Solomon took a tax from all the people in Israel. And when you start reading it, you would think that you're talking about money. The verse says very clearly, no, it was not money. The levy consisted of 30,000 men. He asked for people. And so in other words, their contribution to the government, to the so-called government of Solomon, was, he says, I want 30,000 men. What did he do? They wanted to have the wood from Lebanon, from all the trees, the cedar trees in Lebanon. So he sent 10,000 people to Lebanon. 1 month they were in Lebanon, and 2 months they were by him, and he rotated them. And then the verse continues and says, more than that. By the end of the day, as you would say, Solomon had 70,000 people who would carry the burden, and 80,000 who worked on the mountain, cutting, hewing. An amazing amount of workforce that he had to build this place. And then it describes the dimension of all that and the revelation of God in the first temple. But we move on in chapter 12, Kings, the first king. Solomon passed away. When King Solomon passed away, his son that was young then, known as Rehoboam in Hebrew. So Rehoboam took over the leadership. He's now the new king. The people of Israel came to him with a request, and they told him as follows: your father made our yoke difficult because we all had to work very hard. We're not complaining. We did it. However, now, would you please alleviate the heavy yoke that was placed upon us, and we will serve you. So Rehoboam answers them, where a lot of time it's known, the Jewish answer. He says, go away for 3 days, come back, and I will have an answer. He decided to seek counsel. So first, he took counsel from the elders who were by his father Solomon. And he says to them, how would you advise? How should I respond to the people? And here, if you listen very carefully what they said. They said to him, if today you become a servant to these people and serve them, and respond favorably to them, and speak kind words to them, they will be your servants all the days. But he ignored the advice of these elders, and he decided to ask counsel of the youth who had grown up with him. And he turns to them, what do you advise? Should I alleviate the yoke that father placed on them? The young men told him, this is what you should say to them. You, father, made our yoke heavy. In other words, that's what he's saying. So he says like this. My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. So now, my father settled you with heavy yoke. I should add to your yoke. My father chastised you with sticks. I will chastise you with scorpions. You're going to even work harder. On the third day, all the people came to Rechavam, and this is what he told them. He says to them, I'm going to have a heavier hand on you. And he did not listen to the counsel of the elders. And that was the beginning of the downfall. After that was the split of the kingdom in Israel. There was the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, because he did not follow the advice of the elders. It is important to note here, because this is a lot of times a big mistake in leadership. When the leader thinks because they have power and therefore they can do whatever they want, that's a very big mistake. But when the leader feels that he's there to serve the people and to listen to what the people have to say, then they would listen to the leader. If you show consideration, then it's a whole different story. So we see something very important, and it's not only in Judaism, it's all over that way, what I would say just common sense, that we saw great leaders that we had, and does not mean that therefore you should not have an opinion. No, of course you should have an opinion, and people want the leader to have an opinion, but they want it should done with respect. Not above the people, but with the people, and then it's a whole different story. So we find something very interesting in the Talmud about this, that it says as follows. There was a great sage by the name of Rabbi Gamliel, and he wanted to appoint a few other people to help out in the leadership. And when he requested from them, they didn't want. Thinking to themselves, does it seem to you that I am offering you a position of authority? So in other words, they felt, we don't want that, because then it feels like we're going to be in a position of authority. So he says to them, it's servitude. He says to them, what do you think? What do you think? That I'm offering you just a position of authority and that's why you don't want to come? So you are running away from the honor? No. It's servitude that I am giving to you. I am giving you a position to serve the people. I'm not giving you a position to be in charge of the people. And that is the whole idea of leadership, the way it is from a Jewish perspective, and no question how it's looked in other places too. And one more idea, before we bring it all together to our discussion here. The Talmud says as follows. It's an interesting description. One of the situations that the Holy One, blessed He, one of the people that He whips for, it says, every day is, in other words, God whips on a communal leader who behaves arrogantly towards the community. when there is a leader that doesn't behave the way he's supposed to behave to the community, he says the Almighty weeps about it. So what is the conclusion of all these lessons? That it has to be the idea of a leader is it's almost coming, not forcing themselves on the people. Because in Yiddishkeit, the success of things is when it comes from within. So therefore, when it came in the original idea, when God says, I want a place down here in this world, it had to be in a voluntary situation. V'yikchu li terumah. Me'es kolish, from every person, asher yidvenu liber, that it is good-hearted. And here comes the other idea that it says over here. Not you should give a contribution, give a donation. You should take. Because a lot of times when you give, you feel you're giving to a cause. And what happened here? Basically, you gave from your thing and then it's all over. No. By giving, you are taking. By giving something to a wonderful cause, you are taking something special from the whole situation. So when you are volunteering to give for the house of worship for God, it's something that should benefit the individual. And that is why the name of this portion is called contribution, Terumah, to give. And that's why that is mentioned even before the commandment, you should build me a place, an abode down here in this world, because the idea here is that we should feel good about our Judaism. We should be excited about what we are doing. And that helps that then when we do it, it's with a lot of joy, with a lot of excitement. And then that accomplishes what God wants from us, to create for Him a dwelling place down here in this world. Let it happen in front of our eyes very soon. Thank you.